Matilda. She's really upset, isn't she? That's because her husband, William, there, that's him, is going off on his boat, and she's really worried she'll never see him again because he's got a really dangerous job on his hands. But sorry, I haven't introduced myself, have I? That's me, Mabel. And that's my husband, Hugh. Hugh the Fleming, they call him. So I suppose that makes me Mabel the Fleming. Anyway, Matilda, the reason she's upset is that it's her wealth. She's a princess, by the way, that paid for William's boat, the Mora. So she'll feel doubly bad if something goes wrong. The thing is, William, who's Duke of Normandy, is setting out for England, where his plan is to fight the English and take over the country. He's pretty ambitious, William. But who are all these people with him?
The invasion force that went to England under William's command in 1066 comprised a combination of different peoples. There were Normans, obviously, Norman aristocracy, who were hoping to make great wealth out of this. But there were others from northern France, from Boulogne, from Maine, and also from Brittany and Flanders as well. And these forces were going, I think, partly, according to the early Norman historian William of Poitiers, because they believed in the justness of William's cause, that he really should be the next king of England, but also because they hoped to be rewarded. And this could imply that, in a sense, these people were mercenaries, or some of them, that they were expecting payment for their contribution. And at the very least, they expected to get lands and other rewards if the conquest succeeded.
There must almost certainly have been a sizable Flemish contingent, because the Flemings were mercenaries in the early 12th, 13th centuries. We know, for example, even as late as 1210, King John had numerous Flemish mercenaries in his army when he went to Ireland. So they were a very warlike, hardy race, and there must have been a very significant Flemish contingent at Senlac Hill, which won the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066.
Warlike? Hugh? Hardly. Well, maybe his ancestors were. Before that big battle, William was known as William the Bastard, which was not very nice, was it? But victory meant that he went from being William the Bastard to William the Conqueror. That would have shown his critics. So, William was now in charge of England, leaving poor old Matilda at home. Typical man, isn't it? But Matilda was one amazing lady.
Well, Matilda's a fascinating character in history. She was the daughter of Baldwin V, who was the Count of Flanders. I think the marriage between Matilda and William actually had a lot of benefits for both sides. But we know, for example, that Matilda would have brought a significant amount of money into the Norman coffers. And of course, we know that she paid for the construction of his principal flagship, the Mona. And it was a marriage in which I think there was a genuine amount of love between both parties. For example, William took the crown of England in 1066. He gave her a coronation as befitting Queen of England on the 11th of May 1068, when he was abroad, because of course he now had England and all his continental possessions. Then of course he trusted her. She was his regent. And we know from various charters and documents that he trusted her implicitly. So there was a great deal it was a very successful marriage. It produced a large number of children, and I think it was a very advantageous match for both.
Oh, that's lovely. Now, at the time, Dyfed was ruled by a chap called Rhys ap Tudor. William signed a deal with him, and yes, times were hard. People had to work from dawn to dusk in the fields, tending the flocks and so on, all for the benefits of the nobility. Plus they had to fend off attacks by the Vikings. But then Rhys was killed by the Normans, and that changed everything. The Normans swept into Pembrokeshire, which paved the way for Hugh's ancestors. But for the locals, it was awful.
Well, the Norman invasion of Pembrokeshire was a major cataclysm for people there, and there was a contemporary poem actually by one of the clergy at St. David's complaining about the oppression and the undoing of the native aristocracy and the cruelty of the Normans, and clearly there was a lot of violence and destruction and the taking over of lands. And then the Flemings come, and they clearly do drive out the Welsh from one part, Tros, and take over. So you might see that almost as ethnic cleansing, but not, I think, necessarily killing the Welsh, but at least driving them from their lands and displacing them. So you have to think of a situation where you have major foreign invasion, conquest, displacement of people at this time, and a very big change in the social and political context of the inhabitants of Pembrokeshire.
So a double whammy, you might say. The Normans, then the Flemings, Hugh's ancestors, arrived. You know, we often wonder why the Flemings, the ordinary people that followed as well as the mercenaries, left the security of their home in Flanders to come to Pembrokeshire. And it seems that even those important men who wrote down history as it happened can't agree.
The great Anglo-Norman historian William of Malmesbury, writing in his History of the Kings of England in 1125, has an interesting account of Henry I sending Flemings to Pembrokeshire.
The Welsh were in constant revolt, and King Henry maintained pressure on them by frequent expeditions until they surrendered. Also, in reliance on an admirable plan for reducing their ebullience, he removed into Wales all the Flemings who were living in England. Many Flemings who had trooped over in his father's time, relying on their kinship with his mother, were lying low in England in such numbers as actually to seem a burden on the realm itself. And so he collected them all together as though into some great midden in the Welsh province of Ross, with all their goods and chattels, thereby simultaneously purging his kingdom and putting a brake on his headstrong and barbarous enemies.
And therefore, this is really quite important evidence for why Henry sent Flemings there, and what they got out of it isn't explained so much by William, whose account is fairly brief.
The Chronicle of the Princes, I Bruti Tywysogion, is one of the most important documents in Welsh history, and that tells us of the arrival of the Flemings as a result of a catastrophic flood of the Low Countries in the early 12th century. Now, it could be that that's referring to a different wave of Flemish migration to that which William of Malmesbury talks about. So it could be that they're both talking about different waves of Flemish migration.
A year after that, a folk of strange origin and customs, with nothing known of where they had been concealed in the island for many years before that, were sent by King Henry to Dyfed. They occupied the whole cantref called Rhos, near the estuary of the river called Cleddau, and drove away all the inhabitants from the land. And that folk had come from Flanders, the land that lies near the Sea of Britain, because the sea had overwhelmed the land and its bounds, and had thrown sand all over the ground, so that the whole land was unfruitful. And at last, since there was no place for them to live either on the coast because of the sea, or in the hinterland because of the great numbers of people living in it, and because they could not remain all together, therefore that folk came to beg King Henry a place wherein to live and to dwell. And he sent them to Rhos. And there they still remain, the inhabitants having lost their land.
For whatever reason, whether because of a flood or because the king wanted to subdue the Welsh, the Flemings were here, and they just got on with it, building castles like Wisson and Haverfordwest, spinning and weaving because they brought a lot of skills with them from home, and trading with the folks back home and many other places as well.
We don't know the numbers, but we know the names of the leaders like Leotard, Little King, Tankard, who founded Haverfordwest, Wiso Flandrensis, who founded Whiston and others. And we know Wiso came over slightly later on. So perhaps there must have still been some sort of communication between South West Wales and Flanders.
Well, he would have written home to tell them how good it was, wouldn't he? In fact, the Flemings and the Normans finished up with a whole string of castles, the Landske line, the idea being to keep those bothersome Welsh out. So that's how we finished up with lots of Welsh speakers to the north of the line and not so many down here.
Haverford was founded by Tankard and his group of Flemish colonists in around about the early years of the 12th century, and Tankard was the leader of this first wave of Flemish migrants. They found a natural spot. The Half West Castle is 28 metres above the river level, so it's a beautiful rocky knoll, defensive, superb defensive site, and of course you've got a very wide river reaching this point. So it was a naturally defensive spot where Haverfordwest was eventually to grow up into the biggest town and also the biggest port in medieval Wales. In fact, before the Industrial Revolution.
So we know about Tankard and Wiso, but there's another chap, Godibert, or Godibert the Fleming as he was known, and he's really important to us. We think Godibert was born in Pembroke Castle.
Godibert is a fascinating individual, and unfortunately we know so little about him. We know that he was born in Pembroke in 1096. We don't even know the names of his parents. Possibly we can conjecture that he was the son of a well-to-do Flemish mercenary captain. We don't know, an officer.
Godibert the Fleming is known mainly through his sons, but there is one reference to him in the earliest surviving pipe roll, that is Royal Accounts of 1130 under King Henry I. So he's mentioned in Pembrokeshire then, so we know he was there by 1130, but he's just this obscure name in a way. However, he seems to have been quite an important person in as much as his sons were knights involved in the English or Anglo-Welsh invasion of Ireland in the 1160s. And according to a Norman-French poem on that invasion, traditionally known as the Song of Dermot and the Earl, Richard Fitz-Godibert, Godibert's son, is said to have been the first to have gone over from Pembrokeshire to help the Irish King Dermot MacMurrough, who'd come over in 1167 seeking help to recover his kingdom of Leinster.
Mais Dermot, les gens tireis, od seguereis, gens anglais, ne menade à Isel tour, selon le 10 de mon contour. Ne, mais un Ricard, comme l'on dire, un chevalet de Pembroke-Sire. Le fils Godobert Ricard, chevalier hier de Bompard, chevalier, archer et sergent, mais je ne sais dès que et quand. Car nous jouerons longuement en Irlande et le gens, car ens ne peut profiter faire, al rey guéresse en la terre. Pour ce que peut errant de gens, que passe astivement.
He was the only one to go over immediately, and the main bulk of troops went over 2 years later, 1169. So he was quite important in that and keen to take an advantage of that. And we also hear of a brother called Robert, I think Fitz-Godibert, in the poem a bit later on. But more than that, it's difficult to say on the tiny amount of contemporary evidence that survives.
And that's why, even now, there are lots of roaches in Ireland. Both Richard and Rodibert were awarded lands around Wexford and Leinster, and Adam, Rodibert's eldest son, founded quite a dynasty. Not content with that, Rodibert's sons, Adam, Henry and David, paid for a chapel on Begerin Island in Wexford Harbour for the souls of their father and grandfather. The coming of the Normans and us Flemings led in time to the building of St. Jerome's in Langum. We brought with us our own form of Christianity, Catholicism. Now don't get me wrong, in Wales they were already Christians, just a different sort of Christian. There were bishops, but the churches, Welsh churches they called them, were very plain compared to what we have now.
The early church in Pembrokeshire was fairly decentralised probably. There was a bishop at St David's from very early on, and we know that there were various local churches, some of which have early inscribed stones and sculpture and so on, which show that they were early, even though the buildings themselves are later. And they were organised probably under these bishops. There's a reference in the Welsh laws to bishop houses in Dyfed, which seem to have been centres that the bishops could go to. But it would be misleading, I think, to see this as a Celtic church completely separate from and independent of Rome. It was rather a more, if you like, conservative and old-fashioned church organisation by the 11th century, by the time of the Normans, compared to many other parts of Western Europe. But nevertheless, it was pretty orthodox and shared many of the features of the church elsewhere in Western Europe.
Trouble is, we don't really know much about these early churches because they haven't survived.
As far as the church itself is concerned, in its physical aspects, of course, there are a large number of medieval churches in Pembrokeshire. Unfortunately, on the one hand, they've been massively restored by the Victorians. On the other hand, they do not go back as far as the 11th or the 12th century. And in fact, there are churches in Wales which are very, very few from that period. The picture I have of the pre-conquest church is that you have these 7 bishop houses, as they're called, in Dyfed, one for each of the cantrefi, which were the lordships and the major administrative units before the Normans came, and survived as the hundreds right on until the 19th century in some form or other. So to try and get back, if you like, to the skeleton of the church before that is extremely difficult. I spent 40 years trying to do it and still haven't got it right.
Gosh, and he's a bishop! But the Normans, when they arrived, boosted the whole system of parish churches, and not always for religious reasons.
One of the fascinating things about, I suppose, the aftermath of the conquest, which was fairly bloody, and especially with the revolt and the harrying of the north and all of that stuff later, was that you get a lot of Norman lords founding monasteries, taking over Welsh mother churches to give to English monasteries, or building parish churches on their own land, churches which then became parish churches under their control. Why? It was guilt. It was expiation of guilt because they had shed blood, and they were trying to get themselves right with God by actually doing that.
So, as well as trying to shorten their time in purgatory, for the Normans, building churches was a very good way of keeping the people under their control. As for the De la Roche family, Adam, Godibert's grandson, you'll remember, paid for Pill Priory near Milford Haven to be built. And then a bit later on, the family built St Jerome's, replacing an earlier Celtic church. And not content with that, in the middle of the 14th century, the De la Roche family paid for an extension to the church by building a north aisle to form a side chapel, a private chapel for the family to worship in, with their own priest, mind you, out of sight of the common people. They must have been very posh. And the family could even watch the service going on, the main part of the church, through a little hole called a squint. Well, they wouldn't want to mix with us common folk, would they? As well as the church, our ancestors had to build themselves somewhere to live and bring up their families, and they really did themselves proud. One branch of the De la Roches already had Roche Castle, and there was also Benton Castle, a hunting lodge overlooking the waterway. So what they then did was to build themselves a nice manor house a little way out of Langum. But all around them, things were changing.
By the end of the 13th and into the 14th century, the Pembrokeshire had changed. Clearly, it was much more settled, and especially after the Edwardian conquest of Wales, in a sense, finally made sure there would be no more danger from the Welsh, and through into the 14th and 15th century that was generally true, apart from briefly in the early 15th century the rising of Owain Glyndwr, which did create a lot of destruction across many parts of Wales, including into Pembrokeshire. But more generally society had, if you like, become more stable and in a way more like society in England, I think, in southern Pembrokeshire, with the villages and the manorial lords and so on. So that this was much less a militarised society, much less a frontier society than it had been when the Normans and Flemings had first come at the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century.
But that's all very well. You're talking about the posh people there, the upper crust. What about us, the people who did all the work?
How society was, how the lives of ordinary people is really difficult to fathom because we've got so few sources of information. What we can say with certainty was it was a feudal society, it was hierarchical, with the lords of the various manors of Pembrokeshire would have held sway. There would have been little kings in their own right. As far as livelihoods are concerned, the vast majority of people are working on the land, labour intensive, or of course with 186 miles of coastline, it would have been traders or fishermen, merchants and that sort of thing.
Typical, isn't it? We work and they act like little kings. But life was getting better.
I think what we can probably say with confidence is by 1400, the 300 years had seen a great deal of economic growth. They'd seen a lot of urbanisation in Pembrokeshire. For example, the growth of towns like Haverfordwest, Pembroke, Tenby. They were now proper boroughs in their own right, with walled towns, merchant classes. Population of Pembrokeshire, we don't know, but it was obviously a much bigger population because of economic growth. So that 300 years was one of growth and, I think, of increasing prosperity.
Good news for us, of course, because with Hugh's job as a wool merchant, we could now buy land. In fact, here we are in this document, renting some out for a tiny amount, 1 iron needle. I think it was for a year. They've even put our names in Latin, Hugo and Mabella. It sounds funny, doesn't it? But Haverfordwest was really exciting in those days.
Historians are very hard-pressed to describe social structures in early societies, and in a time when there were no census records, no diaries, it's very difficult to actually get the social structure of a place like Pembrokeshire in the early modern period. All I can say is that most of the records that have survived are almost exclusively dealing with taxation, exchequer returns, property transactions. But we do get the names of people, and it's a remarkably rich mix of cosmopolitan names, Welsh names, English names, Norse, Flemish, and so it's a cosmopolitan community. How the dynamics worked was, one would imagine that the sort of Norman barons with their Flemish mercenaries, they would have obviously controlled the levers of power, but how it actually worked further down is very difficult to describe because of the paucity of records.
So when you went to the market, you heard lots of different languages, but we were rubbing along together pretty well by then.
We have good evidence for society in South Wales at the end of the 12th century from Gerald of Wales, who came from the area, and he makes clear that there are several groups. There are the Welsh, there are the people like himself who are of, if you like, Norman ancestry, but have settled in Wales and intermarried to some extent with the Welsh. And there are the Flemings, who stand out as a distinctive group, though they also married into Norman families, at least, though not with the Welsh as far as we can see. And there's clearly interaction between these different groups, presumably with trade at the boroughs like Haverfordwest. It was necessary, even though that was run probably by the Flemings, for people of, if you like, Norman and Welsh descent to go and interact with them.
But I'm jumping ahead of myself again. One year, 1315 I think it was, so about 100 years after St. Jerome's was built, a lovely thing happened in the village. Sir David de la Roche, who was really top dog in Langum and a direct descendant of Godebert the Fleming, got married to Lady Joanna, who was from another branch of the de la Roche family. We girls were ever so excited. Her family had arranged the marriage when she was about 12. and they would have drawn up contracts including the dowry and property. Sir David would have had to pay a deposit, and if he backed down, he would have lost his money and more. Quite right. Before the wedding, Joanna bathed in herb-scented oils, put on makeup and bleached her hair. And you should have seen her wedding dress. A silk gown with gold embroidery and a garland of flowers in her hair. Oh, she was lovely. Sir David looked really smart too. They plighted their troth outside the church door, with Joanna standing on David's left because, as we know, women were formed out of Adam's left rib. That's funny to think of it, isn't it? Just as well they didn't take it all. And then they had an awfully long nuptial mass in the church. Afterwards we had a great time. There was a feast with minstrels and a wedding cake put together from small cakes all the guests brought with them. We weren't invited, it was just for the nobility, but we could watch from the outside. Then, just before midnight, the guests would follow David and Joanna to put them to bed with a potion called bride's broth. I wonder who invented that? Anyway, we all wanted David and Joanna to live happily ever after. She looked so beautiful on her wedding day, and he was so handsome. But it wasn't to be. They just had one baby, Robert, in 1316, and that was it. She died when he was born. Isn't that sad? Robert died young too, and his son John was taken into his Aunt Isabel's wardship, so she would have made all the decisions about his upbringing. But even though John was away a lot of the time, the family wanted to make sure they weren't forgotten, so they commissioned a really lovely effigy of Robert. Very expensive it was too, in St. Jerome's. If paying for effigies also shortens your time in purgatory, let's hope it did the trick for the Delaroches. As the years went by, some things changed but others didn't. For example, people still spoke their own languages after all those years.
We know that one of Gerald of Wales's brothers spoke Flemish to one of the prominent Flemish leaders of the time. So this was a world of different peoples who are interacting in different contexts.
Hugh certainly went on speaking Flemish for ages. Well, he had to when he was trading with the wool merchants back home. And we kept to our old customs. Everyone knows, for example, that you can predict the future by boiling the shoulder blade of a sheep. And one chap who came visiting reckoned some people understood Flemish ages after that.
Lucas de Heer, who came to Pembrokeshire in 1567, he records that he was able to converse with a number of families in a form of Flemish. Now that is a absolutely remarkable survival. If that's the case, they came here in the 12th century, and that means that they were still able to retain the essence of their identity into the reign of Queen Elizabeth I.
So, the Delaroches continued on their way until we get to John Delaroche. He was the son of Robert, you remember, the chap commemorated by the effigy. I'm sorry if all these family members are getting confusing. Anyway, John married a lady called Elizabeth de Birmingham, and they went off to live in the English Midlands. So that's him out of the picture. His cousin, Margaret Fleming, married a chap called Sir Roger de Clarendon. But poor Margaret died in 1382. They weren't a tough lot in those days, were they? And she was really young. She hadn't even reached her 21st birthday, which made her both his wife and his ward. Complicated, isn't it? It also caused huge problems for Sir Roger, who couldn't inherit the Delaroche lands.
Sir Roger de Clarendon is a really interesting individual. He was an illegitimate son of the Black Prince, who of course, and his father was King Edward III. And in fact, the Black Prince had sired 3 illegitimate sons by the time he was 19. So such was the mores and behaviour of princes of the blood. They could get away with that sort of thing. But Sir Roger was interesting because he was married to Margaret de la Roche. And, you know, if it wasn't for the fact that she had predeceased him, he would have come into possession of the Delaroche land and obviously had that direct link himself with places like Langum.
Poor old Sir Roger. But it gets worse.
Sir Roger de Clarendon, obviously being a half-brother of Richard II, would have been in danger when Bolingbroke became King Henry IV, and of course we find in 1402 Sir Roger being hanged. Could have been a trumped-up charge that he was spreading rumours that Richard II was still alive. Bolingbroke, Henry IV, knew that wasn't true because, of course, he'd had Richard II starved to death in Pontefract Castle. But, they didn't really need sort of much due process of law, and so he had him hanged in 1402.
Gosh, that's awful. But there you have it. That branch of the Delaroche family died out with the death of Margaret, and the Delaroche lands passed to her 4 cousins. So, after all that work and effort, moving from Flanders, building up a fortune and a dynasty, that branch of the family comes to an end with the death of that poor young woman. But of course, there are still Roaches in Ireland, and goodness me, Princess Diana's mum was originally a Roach, as well as in other places like Wiltshire, Cornwall, Somerset, the Isle of Wight even, where the women married and various branches of the family moved. And when you think that the whole web of people came from just one family, one man even, Godebert, whose descendants became Fitzgodeberts, then Delaroche, and then plain old Roach. And they took their place in Wales and beyond, alongside other Flemish families and Norman families, and families from all over Europe. And just like in Haverfordwest Market in medieval times, we all rub along, most of the time, happily together.